Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sundance TV HQ. My name is Andy Garland. I'm the Vice President of Production at Broadway Video, and I'm so honored to moderate this panel about the business and art of filmmaking. So without further ado, I'll just invite up our panelists. Give it up. So we have a great group here today. I'll introduce them very briefly. I think they'll probably introduce themselves much better than I ever could. So we've got Jacqueline Olive, the director of Always in Season, the very powerful documentary Always in Season. Peter Saraf, producer of The Farewell and co-founder of Big Beach Films. Tom Dunlap, attorney and partner at Dunlap, Bennett and Ludwig. And Hannah Pearl Utt, the director, co-star, and co-writer of Before You Know It. So thanks for joining, everybody. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So I thought maybe we'd start with Peter, if we could start with a question for you.
Sure.
At first, if you could just introduce The Farewell.
Oh, The Farewell. You mean like what it's about? Or?
What it's about.
So
yeah.
The Farewell is a story about a young woman named Billy who lives in New York. She was born in China, and but raised in America, and she remained very close with her Chinese grandmother, her Nai, very, very close. And when Billy's about 30, she finds out that her grandmother has stage 4 lung cancer and only has a few months to live. But her family decides that the best thing for Nai is not to tell her that she's sick. But the family is dispersed all over the world. They all want to go see her. But if they all showed up, she would know. So they convince Billy's cousin to get married. So they can have a wedding. Billy is not exactly on board with this plan, but she goes to China against everybody's wishes and plays along, and all the dynamics of the family come into play in this heightened situation.
Peter, could you speak a little bit about what it's like to shoot in China, particularly not in a production center like Beijing or Shanghai?
Well, we shot the film in a city called Changchun, which is sort of a second or third tier Chinese city. I would think most Chinese people wouldn't even know of it. It's only 10 million people who live there. And it's in the west. It's like 140 miles due north of Pyongyang, if you want to picture sort of where it is. It is actually, when you drive into town from the airport, there are all these very old, faded signs calling it the Hollywood of China. And it used to be a long, long time ago a production center, but nothing has shot there in forever. I think the last major movie to shoot there was Last Emperor. Because there were still some studios and stuff back then. There really aren't any stages. It's different. It's challenging in a lot of ways. I mean, you have a crew, we don't speak the same language. We had a great Chinese producer with us and a great crew. We brought in most of our department heads. The crews are very large. This is a very small budget movie, but very large crews. They're on a contract for 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Labor laws are a little different there.
I'd say.
Everybody lives in the same hotel, the entire crew, whether they're local or not. The meal break is something like, let's have lunch. Everybody grabs a box lunch, 5 minutes, lunch is over, get back to work. It's a different, but then at the end of the day, it's also kind of refreshing that the process of making a movie is universal. I mean, it's still, we're going to do camera setups, we're going to do takes, we're going to, everybody understands the language of what we're doing. So.
Any tips for aspiring filmmakers who are going into foreign co-productions?
Foreign co-productions? Find a great partner locally, a great local producer or production services company that knows that country, that place where you're working.
Thanks. So, Hannah, if you could introduce your film and maybe talk about, perhaps there's a stark contrast between filming in China and filming in New York City.
I don't know. Really similar. Yeah, no, I won't. The movie's called Before You Know It, and it's about a family in New York who are all still living in an apartment together above the theater that they own and operate. And the story focuses on the incredibly codependent relationship between these two adult sisters who are still living at home with their father and one of the sisters' 13-year-old daughters. and what happens to them when they unearth this massive family secret that basically turns their world inside out, and they have a real paradigm shift in their family dynamic that forces them to address the dysfunction within their relationship. I guess they find out their mom's alive and starring on a soap opera. That's the thing. There are other surprises. And what was the other question? Shooting in New York?
Yeah. If you could speak generally about shooting in New York, particularly on an independent production.
I loved it. I think the crews there are really great. It's nice that it's not the center of the industry per se. I live in LA, so I noticed a really stark contrast to the attitude with regards to making things in LA versus making things in New York. It's a little more, people are just more down to get it done in a scrappy way and excited about taking risks and working on small things that could be big things. And not to say that doesn't happen in LA, but I think because there's so much work in LA and it's an industry town, it's like a factory town, you're getting less diverse perspectives and people are less willing to work for less than their rate or whatever.
So did filming in New York allow you to engage better a different crew? I mean, were you able to engage perhaps like a different crew head than you would if you had shot in LA and develop a more comprehensive creative team?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's true. A lot of the people we worked with also knew each other from film school in New York and had been coming up together, and that's always really nice when you can come into a community that's already been established, especially when I was working with a lot of people I hadn't worked with before, and it was my first feature, and that's extremely nerve-wracking. Most of my collaborators were on the West Coast. To work with people who have their own relationships and bonds with their own teams was super important.
That's really cool.
I can't tell if I'm answering the question.
You
so
are
just keep
very
me on
well,
track. Okay.
as far as I can tell.
She actually had a really interesting challenge. You were telling me about your credits challenge that you had.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of a hurdle she had to overcome that I thought was an interesting.
A thing about doing something for the first time is you can't anticipate all of the challenges, and there are decisions you have to make before you understand the effect of that decision. And that's definitely the case I found that to be the case with credits. You negotiate everything up front, which is super important, but there were compromises I was being asked to make on certain credits that were going to limit my options in the edit when I was putting together my credit sequence. So my advice would be, if you don't know yet how a decision you're making is going to affect the process down the line, kick the can down the road as much as you can, and create as much flexibility for yourself as possible. Just keep an eye out for your future self and communicate that with your producers. If you're not sure about something, don't pretend that you are. Just say, I don't know, and I will know, and please give me the time and flexibility to come to the right decision. And then make sure your lawyer knows that too.
So that's sort of interesting. So as a lawyer, my advice along those lines, if you need flexibility, but is to get it in writing with your actors ahead of time so you have the left and right limits of what your actors can demand of you later on in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened a little bit with your credit thing.
Yeah, there's just certain things that, people want single cards and they're at a point in their career where they deserve that, and that's totally fair, but there are other actors who say, well, if anyone other than main cast gets to be in main titles, then I also get to be in that. So if you give that to that one actor, then all of a sudden you have this other random, not random, everyone's important, but you want to be able to curate the audience's experience, and you want to introduce them to the movie the way you want to introduce them, and the credits are sometimes part of that. Yeah, that's.
Tom, I'm guessing you almost never say kick the can
Never
down the
say
road.
kick the can down the road. I could see where it would work, but if you can lock somebody down, for example, to say, well, you're not going to get your own card, for example, and that actor comes back to you and says, well, he does. You can say, well, you signed a contract and the movie's made, so I get it, but look, what we talked about.
Yeah.
So there's
Kick the can, kicking the can down the road, I think what you were referring to, and I would subscribe to this as well, is meaning leaving as many contractual options as you possibly can, whether the titles are going to be in the front of the movie or they're going to be main on ends, or whether shared cards or possible shared cards. It's great. You can always give somebody a shared card if you decide later you want to give them a single card. They're not going to hate you for it.
Yeah, and you can create space in the language. If you say main titles, you can decide to split your main titles between the beginning and the end. And then you decide where that goes.
So you just need a good contract.
Yeah, exactly.
Which means
I always have a clause in my contract that says that I have the ultimate decision, ultimately, which I think is a good out.
That's amazing. Yeah.
if you can get it,
It works. She's fabulous.
I want Mallory. I want that.
It depends actor by actor, right? Though sometimes it's hard to. I found depending on who you're dealing with, sometimes you can't get that. It's fantastic when
But
you
it's
can.
executive producers. It's everybody. It's in everybody's.
I've been
contract.
fortunate enough that it hasn't been a problem.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Everyone.
Jackie, could you introduce your film?
Yeah, so I'm the director, producer, and writer of Always in Season, and it's a documentary feature that I made for almost a decade, and it's premiered on Saturday here, which is just really pretty amazing. Always in Season features the relatives and perpetrators, the relatives of the perpetrators, victims, and spectators of lynchings. I've been filming in communities where people are dealing with the lingering impact of historic lynchings. And even though the topic is historic, the film is through a contemporary lens. We're looking at how that impacts people today. And then it connects that history with the story of a 17-year-old named Lennon Lacey who was found hanging from a swing set in Bladenboro, North Carolina in 2014. And many people, including his family, believe that he was lynched. And so it's really important to weave the way that violence, that seminal violence, because lynchings, there were nearly 5,000 lynchings of African Americans where tens of thousands of people came out to watch a lynching. So when you have violence that's so seminal and so impactful in a community, then it merely evolves unless you unpack it and you really start to address it.
It strikes me that your film isn't just a description of something, it's an investigation. And I wanted to ask you whether that informs your production process, particularly a lengthy one where events are happening in real time.
Yeah, well, it's, I went back and forth about going down this rabbit hole of looking at it in terms of a deeply investigative piece. And there is a bit of that. But where I landed is that the film is not a whodunit, like what happened to Lennon. And I'll just backtrack and say that after 3 days after Lennon was found, the police determined that he committed suicide, doing very minimal investigative work. And so his mother, Claudia, really pushed to get an FBI investigation open into the case. So there are some investigative reporting elements. But what was really important for me was to show where the family is now and where the community is left. Without a proper investigation, they have no idea what happened to Lennon. So they're left with stories and speculation and rumors in the same way that people are left in communities where historic lynchings have happened.
Could you speak a little bit about the use of archival footage in the film?
Yeah, so we have, there's a collection of lynching photographs and postcards called Without Sanctuary. And so as I was researching, I spent 2 years researching before I even began shooting. I came across those photographs and learned that men, women, and children posed with the bodies of the victims. So you see smiling spectators posing with the bodies of the victims. Those photographs were often turned into postcards, and those postcards were then mailed. So there was a lynching where 15,000 white men, women, and children came out to watch the lynching of Jesse Washington, who was tortured and mutilated over hours. Those images of his burned body were turned into postcards. So there's one from someone named Joe who sent it to his mother saying, "This is the barbecue that we attended last night." And so it's really important for me to understand the scope of for people to understand the scope of the terror so that we can better understand what's going on around us now. Those photographs are in the film, and I wanted to use them differently. When I began filming in 2010, there was very little national conversation about this. But those photographs pop up on social media a lot, and they pop up with very little context, and they're really horrific, gruesome images that were about stripping the victims of the last shred of their humanity. You know, they were brutalized, and then they were photographed on top of that. And so I wanted to be really careful about how I use those. And so And also I wanted to use them in a different way, for people to start to look at the perpetrators and the spectators, in addition to the victims, if not more so in the film, because it really is an opportunity to examine the power dynamics of lynching in a way that is not just about, often in this country, where we can be, when we start to talk about racial justice, we can be far more comfortable with looking at the folks who are victimized, and a lot less comfortable with looking at the perpetrators.
Did you have trouble getting permission to use some of the content or interview some of the people? Did you run into some of that?
Yeah, so I formed a partnership early on with the people who own the collection of lynching postcards Without Sanctuary. The National Center for Civil and Human Rights owns that collection, and so from the very beginning, they were really generous with letting me use them. I wouldn't say that there was much of an issue with archivals, although there was a bit of coverage of Lennon's mother, Claudia, and Pierre, and there were photographs out there that we weren't able to get permission to use, quite interestingly. And I moved to North Carolina to be close to filming, so it was some of the photographers there that I actually knew that were kind of the hardest to get rights from, but we got quite a few. In terms of interviews, my background is in news. I shot news, sports, and weather. I did some reporting for an NBC affiliate in my hometown in Mississippi. So I'm really skilled at asking people to, before I came to documentary, I'd asked hundreds of people for interviews, and most people said yes. There have been instances where it's been difficult to get a yes. And one of the communities, I filmed in 9, only 3 are featured in the film, but there was a community in Lawrence, South Carolina, where there's a redneck, they call it euphemistically, the redneck shop, in the middle of downtown in the business district, where they sell Klan robes, neo-Nazi memorabilia. They have white supremacist organizations come and meet there. No one was okay with that except for a reverend, a black minister. And so I filmed with him for about a year. In that community, it was really difficult to get anyone to talk about it. And I find that the difficulty, when I come up against those roadblocks, it's generally an issue of fear and intimidation, and people wanting to maintain that storyline that everything's great racially here and harmonious. And when I was in Monroe, where they do part of the film, we feature a group of people, a diverse group of people who come together to annually reenact a 1946 lynching, a quadruple lynching. And so they do that every year to make sure that the victims are never forgotten. And they believe some of the perpetrators are still living there. And in Monroe, when I would go and I would film, particularly with African Americans, and I would want to film outside because you want to get some good natural light. And people would not want to talk about it outside. And even when I went inside into their homes, they would whisper. And so I got a sense that decades later, there's still these dynamics of fear going on.
Peter, would love to talk about, it strikes me that The Farewell is a film that was cultivated by producers from the very beginning. It'd be great to know what that process was like on The Farewell for you and the Big Beach team, and also if you have any guidelines or ideas about how producers and creators interact successfully.
Sure. You could say it was cultivated by producers, but it's really cultivated by Lulu Wong, who wrote and directed the film. Lulu, so I first heard the story on This American Life. She told, the movie is based on Lulu's, herself and her family. And I first heard it on This American Life, and I immediately was like, that's a movie. I mean, the idea of it, the storytelling, everything about it screamed movie to me. I called up Ira Glass from This American Life, and I said, Ira, I want that one. He said, great, but that's one that I don't have the rights to. Generally, the show has film rights to their stories. He said, because Lulu is a filmmaker, which I was not aware of. He said, call her up. So I called her up. And coincidentally, Chris Weitz, who produced the film with me, he is much more sophisticated than me. He DM'd her on Twitter. Saying, I don't know how to do that. I just called her. So in that case, she was like, wow, guys, this is so great. You both want to do this. And rather than compete, we decided to collaborate. And so we started working with Lulu on the screenplay and developed it. And it was a great process. I mean, she's very collaborative. Chris is a writer as well as a producer, and really a great mentor as a writer. and was enormously helpful. We were able to shape the story into something, and then that we were all really excited about, and then start the casting process. And at the time, somebody in my company suggested, what about Awkwafina, who hadn't really done really not much acting. And I remember when Danny Amelia, who works with me, who was the sort of on-the-ground producer, said to Lulu, what about Awkwafina? She said, wait, you mean the rapper who did My Badge? I don't know if I'm allowed to say, which is like her big breakout hit song. And she's like, yeah. She's like, oh, okay, I'll take a look at her. And then, I mean, Awkwafina, she auditioned for the role, and it was amazing. And so that's how that came together.
Thanks.
What was it like the nuts and bolts of making that co-production deal with the filmmaker and then another producer? How did you?
Oh, that was easy. I mean, we often work with other producers, or we often collaborate. I always say that I don't care where a great story comes from, whether we generate it ourselves and it's a homegrown project, or whether somebody comes in with a script or an idea and we work on it with them together. I'm just in the business of trying to tell great stories, and that's what I want to do. I want to identify great stories. Great storytellers enable and encourage and produce that work. So working with Chris, we quickly we were able to, they have a company called Depth of Field. We were providing the financing as well as producing, so we made a deal with them as producers, and off to the races.
And put her into the.
And we made a deal with Lulu as a writer and a director and a producer. She's a producer on it, so that was non-controversial and easy. The hardest part, I mean, of producing this movie is I think we're the first, or one of the very first, independent films to qualify as a Chinese co-production, which means we get something really cool called a dragon seal on our movie, which I'm like really excited about.
Cool.
And basically, what that means is China has a quota for foreign films, and for American films, it's a small number. I forget what it is. It's eaten up immediately by the big studios for the big Marvel and Disney movies and whatnot. And then everything else, it's very hard to get a theatrical release for your movie. You can do a streaming deal or something like that, but they're very small. So because we are a co-production, Chinese-American co-production, we are officially a local film. So we're not subject to those quotas, and our movie can be distributed in theaters in China. But very, very, very complex process to get there.
Was there a lot of value in Chinese distribution?
We don't know yet.
Okay.
I think so. There's a lot of interest in our movie. What's happening in China is that they are building enormous movies theaters everywhere, and movies are released typically on 35 to 75,000 screens at once. And by comparison, a massive blanket release in America, the biggest movies are 6,000 screens. I don't think we even have 75,000 screens in America. But they are, and a lot of these cities and towns have never had movie theaters before, so it's a spectacle. So what's typically popular in these movie theaters are big, huge spectacle movies. It's kind of like the early days of American cinema. Let's go see something that's just going to wow us. So whether that's a big Marvel movie or a local language, big, huge, mega production, those are the kind of movies. Independent films, small sort of stories like ours are just starting to find a place in the marketplace. So we'll see.
Wow.
Speaking of the marketplace, congratulations on the sale to A24 of
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I'm curious whether Sundance is an integral part of that process of selling the film, and if it is for Big Beach generally.
Yeah, I mean, Sundance is a huge part of my career of Big Beach as a company. The first film I brought here was in, I think, 96 or 97, a movie called Yuli's Gold. I actually started coming to the festival before that. I've been coming ever since. I don't know how many movies I've had premiere here. It's a lot. So it's an incredible showcase for independent film and the most important marketplace for independent film, which has its pluses and minuses. But the market is very important. And so being able to have this platform to introduce the movie to audiences and to introduce the movie to potential distribution partners is critical.
Do you also find creators that you'd like to work with here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Hannah, other questions for you. So I think a lot of our audience is probably familiar with your work on Disengaged. I would love to hear about like what's different between a series like that and in a larger independent feature.
You mean in terms of like the experience of making it?
Yeah.
Well, Disengaged, first of all, it's a totally different writing experience when you're doing short form stuff. Disengaged is a 10-part digital series that my co-writer on Before You Know It and I co-created for Super Deluxe, which is Turner's online platform that no longer exists. And I directed everything. We were in everything, and we were their first narrative series. So the great thing was we got to kind of forge our own path and put it together the way we wanted to. The downside of that was that I bit off a little bit more than I could chew on the production side. I basically asserted myself as the line producer, which I am not, because I just had so many people I knew I wanted to hire, and we worked that out after the pilot. But working on short form stuff, you learn how to be really specific about every moment you're putting on screen. The writing had to be so tight, and we had one day to shoot each episode, so there wasn't a ton of I didn't have a ton of creativity in the shots per se, but I set it up so, again, I had as much flexibility as possible in post, and we were able to kind of dance with the actors, and the actors were really well rehearsed and knew their characters really well. So a lot of the work happened in prep. And then it was just a matter of making sure I was shooting the beats so that I could cut it to, match what we had written. And the movie was much more of a fluid, I just had more time. I had more time, and I was able to take bigger risks visually because I had the support to do that. And it was a little more flexible in terms of the script and how actors were interpreting the material on the day. It was less about needing to get a shot so that I could land a joke, if that makes sense. And even the sense of humor of the movie changed depending on what we felt about where a character was in their arc and what was true to that character in that moment.
So you felt more freedom to experiment.
Yeah, I guess so. I think there was more experimentation on the front end in Disengaged, but it seems crazy because there's never enough time in independent film, so the idea that we were experimenting more on the movie doesn't actually make sense to me when I say it out loud, but it felt that way. But both was, just giving myself as many options as possible. Short form stuff is such a great way to cut your teeth, though, and show people that you can do this, and there is an audience for your work. I highly recommend it.
Your film has such an amazing cast. I mean,
Thank
you for one.
Yeah, thank you.
But also, there's some other pretty prominent actors in your film, too. Could you talk about working with them and also how a first-time filmmaker engages actors like that?
I think as an actor myself, engaging with the actors was one of the easiest parts of this process for me. That was where I felt like I could really relax. We have Judith Light in the movie. We met her at the lab. So I did the directing lab, and they provide you with a casting director, and they give you a list, and her name was on it. And I'm obsessed with her, and it was a dream come true. And she has the same spirit of collaboration that I believe in, and was so giving of herself, and really helped Jen and I understand the character in a way that we were struggling to do. because she's a woman who leaves her children, and we found that we had been judging her, which was so against everything we believed in, that having Judith actually put a human face to it and her own experience was super helpful. So it's a lot of like questions. It's a lot of getting the actors on the same page about the world we're in and what their point of view is and what their relationships are to everyone. I want my actors to be able to answer any question about the character at any moment, because that's how I feel the most safe as an actor, and that's how I'm able to experiment as an actor. Mandy Patinkin, we found through, I use this term goddess. We only work with goddesses. Initially, we used it to describe like kind men who revere women, but women are also goddesses. Women who revere women are goddesses. Anyway, we got to Mandy through a series of a channel of very successful goddesses who believed in us and believed in the movie and got him the script really quickly. And then I was on the phone with him the next day, and he just connected to the material. That's the big secret to casting. Everyone's always like, how did you get this person? It's the script. Actors want to do things that they connect to, and the size doesn't really seem to matter. It matters a lot to their agents, and that sucks. So no offense to agents, I love my agents. Try to like get around them. Like getting right to the source. That's why I mentioned the goddesses. Like just getting to the person you actually want to get your material to is so helpful, because that's how they make their decisions. Alec was connected to the movie pretty early on because of Mallory. One of my producers had worked with him. And it
Alec
was a
Baldwin
similar.
you're referring to.
Yes, sorry, Alec Baldwin. It was a similar thing. He believed in us and he believed in the movie and wanted to support us. Also, he has a really fun part. And then the girls we found through our casting director, young ladies, young people, young folk. Rory Bergman, who's just incredible at finding young talent.
So did you negotiate with each actor yourself, or did you kind of say, well, here's generally what we're doing, and then hand it off to somebody, or how did you actually get them onto the project from a practical, aspect?
Having Alec attached was really helpful to set the precedent, because he signed on it. Am I allowed to, Mallory? Yeah. Am I allowed to talk about this? Okay.
Good call.
He signed on at scale, which means just, the standard rate. And once you have someone like that who's agreeing to do your movie, everyone else kind of gets on board. And so negotiating rates wasn't really a big thing. Credits, I think, are always kind of tedious, but more so for the producers than for me.
So you did it yourself then?
No, we had a production lawyer,
Gotcha.
attorney that my producers were dealing with. I have my own lawyer who oftentimes was fighting for things on my behalf that I felt weren't necessarily serving the movie, because he was working for me as an actor and as a writer and as a director. So he'd be like, I got you this as an actor. I'd be like, I don't want to set that precedent. I don't need that. That should go into production. So that's also a thing to keep in mind, is what are you, the difference between fighting for your rights as a creator and asking for things that will potentially take away from your production and the amount of freedom you have down the road.
Okay.
One final question before we open it to Q&A. Tom, do you have any are there any basic considerations that a filmmaker should keep in mind as they start a production?
I mean, I would ask you guys, it seems like start with a lawyer if we're talking about most things. For good or ill, it kind of sucks that you have to pay somebody to do this, but a lot of brand new filmmakers, you guys are all really pretty experienced, but I think that's something that I've run into where they've started the production process and signing people up, and then they're like, oh, hey, and could you look at these contracts we've already signed? And could you look at this footage we've already shot, and it has some other movie playing in the background, or a whole bunch of things that aren't cleared. So I think starting early, just being aware of the things you have to be aware of, at least talking to somebody about that. I think that would be, I don't know if you
definitely need a lawyer, but I wonder about this. Let's say you're a young filmmaker who wants to make a movie, has little to no money to make their movie, needs legal representation. There are agents out there who will say, I believe in this talent. I'll take a risk on you. But also agents don't get paid up front. They get paid a commission. There are other people who will do that. Are there lawyers, and I think there are, but who will say, you know what, I want to cultivate your career. I'll either do it for free or for very little money, because I believe in you and I want to.
Yeah, so there are. So actually, almost every state, I'm in DC, and in Maryland and Virginia and DC, there are pro bono organizations for the arts, pro bono for the arts. I volunteer with one of them. And you can go there and get very basic free advice and some free contract stuff. So, I mean, if you are at $0 starting your first movie, my point is you should start there.
Right.
Like, talk to somebody.
Yeah.
So that you know what you're missing.
There's a Cardozo Law Clinic in New York.
Yeah, that's right, Cardozo too.
My other advice too, even if you have an attorney, which you should immediately always operate with a contract, is that you understand your contracts, make sure that you know them.
Yes.
Because as you start to get into the thick of it with distributors and you're making very quick decisions contractually, you don't want to get up to speed then. You want to know early on what certain clauses mean and what you're looking for and what's important to you.
If you go into a Chinese co-production with Chinese people that you don't really know, make sure you have a really good contract ahead of time. I think that's pretty fair advice.
Yeah.
So you want to, even with your partners, I think it's probably that's the first thing, is know what you and your partners are doing before you do anything else. Even if it's on the back of a napkin to start, but eventually you need to progress to some place where you have a signed agreement.
My lawyers worked for free for me for years.
Did
I
they?
mean,
Good
well,
for them.
he'll take a commission
Right.
when there's something to take a commission from, but it's been a while. So he has, he's invested in the long term.
In the long term, yeah, he believes in you.
And I love him very much if you're watching.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the same lawyer for 25 years, and she's a key part of my team. I mean, a key part.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a common misconception in our business, and it is a business, and it involves a lot of people, so you do need understandings for when things go wrong. That's what contracts are for. If everything's going right, you'll never read that again. But if something goes wrong, you do need to, it's a little more complex than that. You need it for a lot of reasons. But I think there's a common misconception that if I'm a creative person, I don't need to understand that stuff. And I think that's, you were saying that basically. That's wrong. You do need to understand.
Yeah.
Because
And you learn the hard way sometimes. We've had a number of film clients come to us after the fact, even when they had a lawyer at the beginning, who've been in fights with their investors or who've been in fights with their agents over things that are in their contract. So you understanding what's in your contract by talking to your lawyer is really important. So you don't have a misconception either, I think.
Yeah, and so they aren't fighting for stuff you don't actually.
Or fighting for stuff you don't need, that they're just fighting for because they're lawyers and they're like that.
I feel bad about the agent thing I said. There were also really great agents who helped us get actors.
it's true, there are.
At this point, I think we're going to open it up to questions in the audience. Please, go ahead.
So,
I think we're going to bring microphones to you, if you don't mind. If you don't mind holding 1 second.
I get a microphone. Okay, so as an independent filmmaker, when creating content for narrative content for broadcast, what are some of the things to be mindful of, maybe not too obvious things to be mindful of when bringing on producers, additional producers, in the long run?
So for me, I would say that be mindful of what producers you have and what these new producers are going to be doing for your production and what they're adding, instead of just adding. I've seen a lot of people add producers for the sake of, well, this is my friend, or this is this actor's husband, or something like that. I mean, that happens a lot, and I think it's generally not a good thing to do that, but it's frequent. So if you're bringing on a producer, make sure they add value, and then make sure you have a contract. I'll defer to you guys in terms of, what that means to bring on additional producers in terms of creative content and value. But my experience has been, don't add a producer for the sake of getting an extra $1,000 for your production.
I would start with a really good creative producer and make sure you have that trust and you share a vision of the movie, and then defer to them, work out who you partner with, because they'll know what work actually needs to be done and the kind of support that they need, and what will help you get financing.
I have a production credit or two that I shouldn't have on IMDb just because I was a lawyer that didn't get paid, for example. So there are many ways to use that too, I guess.
Yeah. I would also say that, particularly if they're not just bringing on money, but you're going to be working with them, is to be really clear in conversation about your expectations, their roles, and your roles, and to really outline that, and then to outline it again in the contracts, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I think that, there's the reason that producing is that it's really misunderstood, and it's defined differently by different people. Even producers define their role very differently, and some people do it differently. But because it's so misunderstood and so vaguely defined, you would never say, nobody in this business or nobody would ever say, I'm going to take a directing credit on this movie, or this TV show. You know what? I'm going to give you a writing credit. I'd like an acting credit on the movie. But these are terms, this happens all the time. We're going to give a producing credit. I'm going to take a producing credit. I deserve a producing credit. The only way you get a producing credit, in my mind, is if you earn it. You have to earn a producing credit. And you earn a producing credit by bringing value to that production, by actually producing it, by taking it from something that is an idea into something that exists. And I'm a former vice president of the Producers Guild of America. I feel very strongly about this stuff, but I think it's really true. But with producers and with everybody, who's joining the project? And you said it. How are they adding value? What are they bringing?
Yeah, even as each producer also can show up in a different way on different projects.
Yeah.
And it's also dependent on the time that they come. So if a producer comes in, like with me, my producer came in the last 6 months or so, after 9.5 years. And so she shows up in a way that's very different than if she had showed up 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And so that's why it's really important to get clear about how you're working together and absolutely specify it in contracting. Because it's not just locking someone in a way that's adversarial, but it's a way of reminding yourself and each other as you go along what your goals are.
But we've all seen production credits for people who give you money. And that's value, but that's, really common, and it's not something to turn away either if it's a lot of money or sufficient amount.
That's a kind of producing as
Yeah.
well.
It is.
It is.
It
They're
should
adding
be.
value.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That should be an executive producer. That's
Right.
what an executive
Right,
producer
exactly.
is. Different in television. Executive producer is the lead creative producer. It's complicated, but
We have time for another question, I'm sure. The gentleman right there. Raise your hand, sir.
I believe that's you.
he's waiting for his microphone. He's
Also,
behaving.
actors will get producer credits,
Yeah.
Sure.
but they do
Yeah,
help
absolutely.
get the movie made. That's
Yeah.
the
Sometimes
point.
actors produce.
They're bringing
Yeah.
value to,
Yeah.
This question is for Hannah. Do you have any advice for emerging narrative filmmakers?
I have so much advice.
Don't do it.
No, my advice is definitely do it. Be persistent and be patient and work really hard with intention and enjoyment with people you can get behind. And it's been really helpful for me to think of myself as an opportunity giver. It's a little more proactive. I know it can feel like you're waiting for things often, and it's easy to get stuck in your own neuroses. But when I think of myself as someone who's able to create the kind of opportunities that I'm seeking for myself, for other artists, it really helps get the job done. Yeah, that's my advice.
And I think, is that all the time we have? Oh, 10 minutes. Oh, great. We have time for more questions. Gentleman right here. Feel bad pointing at people, but I'm not sure if there's a more effective way.
A question about these producers that you bring on. If they are bringing value in their creativity, how much of the intellectual property can they claim or will they own?
Ooh, 0. So all the intellectual property needs to be housed inside of the production company, or so that you can transfer it. You can't split pieces of intellectual property off of film. You could. It'd be a very bad idea, I would say.
That might be a good entree into just ideas about copyright in general. Could you speak to that?
So, that's something generally that we've talked about in this panel before is things that creative side of the project don't always think about is getting clearance for all of the little nitpicky things that are in your film ahead of time and starting with that from ground zero. There have been changes in the law recently. We were just talking about one in the green room. So does anybody know what the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is? If you've ever made a documentary, it's a big part of what you did. But it's part of the Copyright Act that lets you cut archival film and use it as part of fair use. There's a part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that gives
My attorney knows.
independent film producers, gives you the right. And so in October of last year, the Copyright Office expanded that, and now you can cut stuff from fiction, which is pretty cool. So it's giving people who make films more rights. Now, don't just go do this because I said this. Like, talk to your lawyer, like tell them what you're doing first. But it's a pretty neat thing. And so I think it's important that you at least understand the basis of copyright and who owns what you do. So if you have a friend and you're making a small film and you're like, hey, could you write a piece of music for this film? And he writes it and you put it in your film and he never signs anything giving it to you, it's still his. And you're never going to be able to distribute that film without a release from him. So these are just these little things. And you make your whole film and he sees it, he's like, that's great, I need $10,000. I know I said it was yours, but it's a pretty good movie. So those are just things to think about that happen for real.
Yeah.
Any other audience questions? Please.
Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is Lonzo, and I'm a filmmaker. And currently, I just finished a screenplay, which is inspired, I'll say inspired, legally. It's inspired by a true crime. I'm not going to say based. But I was just wondering, because of that, what legal ramifications could I run into? Because I've changed location names, but there are certain elements because of just the story I couldn't necessarily change, because it had to happen. Sure. So yeah, do you have any advice on that?
I mean, so fair use is very case specific, and people have the rights to their own stories, and it varies, this is even worse, state by state and country by country. The best thing you can do is try to purchase the rights from the people involved in the events. Obviously, if it's true crime, it's probably very difficult. If you can't do that, then you really need to have a lawyer get in close with you about what you're doing and how close it is to the events that happen and who might have those rights. Nobody may have those rights. You may be able to make it without any permission. Yeah, so I hate to say it, but you've got to spend some time with a lawyer. Yeah. And that's really the only answer there is, because fair use isn't like, this is fair use, that's not fair use. Fair use is like, this is probably fair use, this probably isn't, in every case. And that's kind of tough. So.
Anyone else? Please.
Hi. I'm just wondering, in prep, or in any part of the process making the movie, are there things that, I know that especially in independent film, there's a temptation to cut corners and not pay for as many things as possible, but are there things that you just absolutely must do that most people don't know about, maybe, or might not know about going in to protect yourself, like getting a lawyer, like getting things signed?
Yeah, you absolutely want to have releases. You want to have the proper release. And so even if you can't afford an attorney, a lot of distributors like ITVS will have releases on their website that are templates to use that will cover you. But distributors won't take your project unless you have the proper releases. It's kind of the baseline. So I would say start there.
It goes back to the intellectual property question. All of your IP has to be in a book, and you guys have probably done this at the end of your film, that has every release for every person and for every location. And if there's a company logo in the background, you need to have a release from that company, because that will unmake your film or cause an injunction to be filed by somebody.
Tom, you made me think of one thing, is that make sure that you scan your documentation, because after 10 years, I have, and it's true also with your all of the receipts and things that are going to go into your bookkeeping, and you want to keep books early on. As soon as you start, it's the better, because it's just going to be more complicated later on. And I went, I got ITVS funding in 2015, and I began the film in 2010, and I started keeping books for the first time in 2015. So I had to recreate all of those books. And I had receipts where the information was worn off. And so you want to make sure that you scan everything immediately if possible.
I talk to a lot of people who have sold short form things to companies to turn into series or whatever, and they don't they don't actually own the IP.
Right.
Like, you know, the company will be like, well, we'll give you the money to make the rest of it, and then it's ours, and of course we'll keep you on it, but legally it's ours. And I would just advise everybody not to make that deal. Like, yes, it's hard to get money to get things made. Don't give your baby away. Like, it can, you know, sorry, metaphorically. Like, just, you will make the deal you should make with the right people. Don't compromise your artistic freedom.
So that's something we get asked all the time. Lawyers get asked all the time. Well, I want to pitch my idea to so-and-so. Can I get an NDA? Has anybody ever run into? So you generally can't get an NDA from somebody with a lot of money. I mean, you might get somebody to sign it. They're really hard to enforce. So that's like a really big challenge. You have to talk to people. I think it goes back to your point. You have to talk to people that you trust before you give your baby away, your idea, your creative.
Sorry. I know.
That's a fine metaphor. It's a good metaphor. Before you give away your creative idea, your creative germ, you have to be careful with who you share it with. And there's no state in the United States except California that has a tort for theft of idea, which California does. It's hard to do, but you know, you can guess why there's a law in California, because a lot of this happens.
Well, I would love to continue this conversation forever, but unfortunately we're out of time. Big round of applause for our wonderful panelists.